Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're kicking off a brand new series called I Don't Do Church, which Pastor Mark feels like a risky title for two guys who work at a church, right?
I've been struggling with how we were going to roll this out, but it really does, man. And I fully expect someone to drive by, see the sign, and think, finally, a church that understands me.
Or they might be thinking, though, that we're closing, Pastor.
Woo! Hey, dispel the myth right now.
That's
Hopefully
right.
not. No, with all we've got going on and lives that are being changed
It's
and
gossip
baptized, and I mean, woo, we're not closing. We're opening bigger. We're expanding.
Right. But honestly, that's the phrase has become incredibly common. That I love Jesus. I believe in God. I pray, but I don't do church. And for a lot of people, that statement feels completely reasonable.
Yeah, it does. But when you, let me sidebar on us a little bit, PJ, and go right to the text that I shared with Sunday. If you look at the whole idea of Hebrews 10, it rolls into, the writer's rolling into an idea of a call to persevere in your faith. And then he lays this thing called the church in, and he says, do not forsake gathering together, assembling together, as some of you are already doing. Now, this is a couple thousand years ago, and it was happening then. So it's nothing new, but it has become a trend in our time right now. And so I wanted to address this. And what I want to do is help people persevere. I'm not trying to put people under an obligation. I'm trying to bring them to a radical transformation. We'll probably talk about that more later. Anyway, enough of the sidebar, right? But let me stay on target here. And I've been around you so much, I got squirrels that are running, bro. And I like it too, by the way. But so people often mean, you know, what do they mean when they say, I don't do church? And it isn't necessarily that they're rejecting Jesus. That's what I want to make clear. Even those that watch from home, I tried to make sure that I didn't do anything to make them feel uncomfortable. But many times they've rejected a version of church that they've experienced. Maybe they were hurt. Maybe they were disappointed. Maybe they got tired of what it felt like to do a religious performance. And some people simply wonder if church is even necessary anymore. And I always like to throw this one in because it's always a two-sided street. Maybe they did something to the church that hurt the church, and they're afraid to come back because of how the church is going to receive them. So I've always got a philosophy. This is bad English again. You know me, bro. But I'm a plank layer. I like to lay planks because if there's a chasm, I want to make it easy for a person to come back to church, come back to God, come back to relationship. I don't like pulling planks up. That creates a larger chasm. And that's what Jesus did when he went across that beam on the cross. He laid a plank across this chasm and said, there's a way back. So I hope I didn't do anything to hurt anyone, there.
Yeah. Well, let's start there, Pastor. Why do you think this question is becoming more common with people?
Yeah, I think because we're living in an age of customization. We want things our way more so than ever. Everything's personalized. Playlists are personalized. Your social media feels it's personalized. Your coffee orders now, go to Starbucks, it's personalized. I mean, written on the cup about that long of I want a double shot, a single shot, a triple shot. I don't even go there. I'm just kind of telling you what I hear on the commercials. But we personalize everything. And apparently some people need 17 adjectives before they'll drink their coffee. So
Pastor, I'm feeling an attack right now.
Yeah, well, you should. Amen. No, but seriously, our culture teaches us to customize everything around our preferences, not principles. You've heard me say this a million times. So eventually we start doing that with our faith. It rolls over into our faith. People begin asking, can I have Jesus without commitment? Can I have spirituality without community? Can I have faith without accountability? Ooh, that's a dangerous one right there. Can I have salvation without participation? And the answer that Scripture consistently gives us to all of those questions is no, 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 no.
Now, Pastor, I'm sure some people are already getting nervous because they're hearing this and thinking, great, here comes the guilt trip about attendance.
No guilt trip. This is invitation into transformation. Can I say that again? I like the way that rolled off. This is invitation into transformation, not guilt, because I want to help them persevere. That's my whole goal. Make it to the end and make it well, And so that's not what we're doing. It isn't about attendance. It's about identity. Out of the other series, notice how they're all linking together, because church isn't primarily somewhere you go. Even though we have a building, church is something God created. And the Greek word ecclesia, now when you understand that, it literally means the called out assembly. Well, a lot of times we'll say the called out ones, but that's not quite accurate. It's the called out assembly, meaning that it is understood that we're going to assemble together so that our faith can persevere to the end. And so the church was never primarily a building, even though the building's important. I don't want to dismiss that, but it's always been a people.
That's right. That's actually one of the biggest misconceptions, though, that people hear church and they think of a location. The New Testament thinks relationships instead of a location.
Yeah, pause right here. This is good. This is going to be a sidebar to get me in trouble, but
I like sidebars.
Yeah, do you? Good.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. For a season, we went through a long time of naming our churches based on the location they were in. We're in a new season now.
That's right.
And a lot of churches are changing their names, not because they're ashamed of who they are, not because they're radically different than who they are. They're trying to communicate a message about what their core values are, or what, living hope or living word, those kinds of names. Instead of a location, it's more about a people and what those people are. This is making sense. And so this even fits into the conversation really well right here. So, which brings us back to the previous series. When we talk about all this, we spent weeks building on identity from the resurrection and how that works. But here's a question that we don't ask enough. What happens next? What happens next? What happens next? That's why these series are linking together. Next one on spiritual warfare, because that's what comes against the church. So if Jesus rose from the dead, what was the result? What did resurrection power actually produce?
I think, Pastor, most people would answer, well, Christianity.
That's good. That's right. But it's a little more, Let's be more specific. It produced the church. Yeah, if you hadn't seen that video, I'll share it with you. But the resurrection didn't simply create believers that are abstractly out there. No, it created assembly. Go back to ecclesia. And so it created a community of believers. The resurrection didn't just save individuals. It formed a body. All the time, throughout Scripture, Jesus is the head, we're the body, and we see that. So it's a family, it's a mission, it's a movement that comes together.
Well, Pastor, let's talk about your earthquake analogy, because I think that's really powerful. Can you dive into that a little bit? Yeah,
and maybe folks are getting tired of it, but I think it still connects, and it's needed to connect. So major earthquakes, things happen, and then comes the aftershocks. This is where we've gone through in the series, but then after the aftershocks, people began to rebuild. I think of California and all those constantly having to rebuild, change the way, evaluate their building structure. How did we build that it didn't survive the aftershock or the earthquake? Now they go back in with new ways of building. They've learned some things. So maybe some folks, this is what I'm trying to get to, PJ. Maybe there's some folks out there listening that are saying, I've tried church and I'm not going back, because of what happened. Well, maybe we've learned some things too. Maybe we're doing church better. Maybe we've learned some things as well as those, and the systems that we're building back are better. Not the word is better. It's always infallible. But maybe we're doing it in a way that we're seeing it more about transformation than occupation. Or, and so what I say around here, we keep it simple. It's about getting lost people saved people discipled, disciple people serving. And the reason serving is not because we're trying to get something out of them. We just know, according to Jesus, he said, I didn't come to be served, but to serve. For a person to really be fulfilled, that serving is part of what fulfills them. So we're doing simple church. That's all we're doing. And we're not trying to confuse it with community programs and projects. Now, do we believe we should be involved in the community? Absolutely. Should we have a voice in some things? Yes, absolutely. But we're not trying to do community projects just so that we're helping the community. We're into transforming lives, and transformed lives will change the community more so than a program will. I'm getting man.
That's good,
so the
though.
resurrection, the greatest spiritual earthquake in history, and then came the aftershocks. Lives were changed, hearts were transformed, the gospel spread. See how it's rolling, and then after all these, God formed something. He formed something that from the resurrection life called the church.
So the church is essentially God's answer to a shaken world, right?
That's a great way to put it. I like that. Yeah, I can live with that one. And so it's why I think it's one of the most important questions that we can ask in this is if the resurrection created the church, then why are so many people trying to follow Jesus without being part of the church?
Pastor, that's good tension in that question.
It
right
is
there.
some tension.
So
I felt it too.
I know. Let me play skeptic.
I almost wanted to apologize.
Well, let me play skeptic for just 1 minute.
Yeah.
What if somebody says, I don't need church, I have Jesus?
Yeah, and I talked about that briefly Sunday, and the next 5 sermons are going to be wrapped around all of this. And I'd say I understand. I do. It sounds spiritual. It really does. But biblically, let's go biblically as well as spiritually, okay? Because I think our spiritual should be backed up by our biblical. We've already read the text, and let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Notice that. Not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encourage one another all the more, and all the more as you see the day approaching. His return is coming. So you can't separate Christ from his body any more than you can separate a head from a body and expect either of them to function properly. So the New Testament simply has no category or isolated Christianity. It's never that way. It's always together.
That's actually fascinating, though, because modern Christianity often assumes independence is maturity. But the Bible presents dependency upon God and interdependency with other believers as maturity.
Pause right there. What did you just say? Interdependency with one another. And here's something. Not only, PJ, does it grow our faith, but it also brings accountability. We don't, by and large, in America, struggle with that. But a lot of times we don't like accountability because then someone can, but here's the deal. I mentioned this Sunday, I think, I may not, I had to skip so much, but Proverbs says that, that the wounds of a friend are better than the kisses of the enemy. Listen, I'd rather wound you and bring you back to Christ. That's Matthew 18:16. That when you've got an alt with a brother and you got something with it, when you go to him and you reconcile, depending on the translation you read, it says you save him, you bring him back to Christ. And when it's received, when it's done in love, that's what it says. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love. When we do it in love, I used to have a joke with old Mike Purnell. So you can do it in love, you just can't love doing it, in that frustration thing.
Yeah.
But when you do it in love, you win somebody back to Christ. And isn't that the goal,
That's
man?
the goal. Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
That's good.
So, this is, and that's more of the apologetic side of it.
Yeah.
And we've done that through that series, and I think it's still bleeding in me some. But, the evidence of Christianity is actually the church itself functioning. And so think about it. The disciples were terrified after the crucifixion. They had no political power, no military power, no money, no influence. We've kind of hashed through those things. Yeah. But yet within a few generations, Christianity exploded across the Roman Empire. Why? Why did it do that? Well, what changed? What was it that made the difference? The resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay. So something happened that transformed frightened followers into courageous witnesses.
Pastor, I think you said people don't die for something they know is a lie.
Yeah, that's good, PJ. We talked about that. The early church didn't grow because, they had better marketing. They didn't grow because they were convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that it's good, all those things, but listen, the conviction of heart's what changed everything.
That's right. And, well, Pastor, let's get a little practical here, all right?
Oh, Lord.
What do you think is the greatest danger of disconnected Christianity?
Isolation. Did that come quick enough?
I did.
Isolation. Satan's greatest tool is to separate. Watch this. Yep. Go back to Genesis 2:3. Watch this. As soon as Adam and Eve sinned, they went and hid.
That is true.
Come on. Go through the Bible, find others. Jacob, Esau, Jacob did some wrong. Hid, on and on and on. Satan's greatest tool is isolation. I say greatest, deception, but isolation comes right there with it. So isolation distorts reality. When you get alone, you don't think clear.
That's true.
Now, so, and don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with getting alone and processing and doing those things. But when you make aloneness your key, then you got. Can I use your word? Squirrels that get to running around in there, and they make nest up in there, and it gets nasty if you're not careful. So that's why you need this accountability. So nobody challenges you in isolation. Nobody encourages you. Nobody shapes you. Nobody notices when you're drifting and calls you back. I had a call before 7 o'clock this morning, and man, was able to do some great ministry early this morning from someone that could have easily isolated, but instead. Watch this. This is, my favorite term. They insulated. They called and wrapped somebody around them, and man, it was like God showed up in the midst of it. And so isolation always leads to emptiness. It leads to discouragement. That's why we got so much depression. Pause with me. I know I'm all over the place on you this morning.
You're good.
Forgive me. I was in a meeting all day long yesterday, so I'm wired up, fired up, and juiced up. But here's the thing. Can I prove this in a recent analogy? COVID-19.
Yeah.
COVID-19 hit us like never before in this nation with something, and immediately young children started cutting themselves, isolation, they were not going to school, adults were having to be medicated left and right, and even the sheriff in Chatham County, where I was ministering then, I went to him and I said, bro, I'm going to do drive-in church. I know what the rules are and all that, but everybody's going to either stay in their car, and then we started doing it under a big tent, and I mean, you guys, I think some did it here at the drive-in theater, but they were riding around. It was almost comical. Before they were getting out of the cars, they were riding around blowing the horn at one another. They brought signs and were holding them out the windows because they wanted other people to see what was going on. But the sheriff himself told me, he said, what you're doing with church is more important than what anybody else is doing, because I'm seeing right now that the suicide rate, he said spousal abuse in the home. They were fighting in the home. Too much, in other words, they were isolated from the rest of the world, and now everything was closing in on them. So I can prove this one. This is true. It's one thing to get it out of the word. It's another thing when we see it in practical application. And that's what you said. Let's do it practical. So I can validate that.
Well, that's true spiritually and psychologically. Every study on loneliness points to the same reality, that humans are built for connection. We're built to have a relationship with one another. So you're spot on.
Yeah, Adam, it's not good for him to be alone. God designed us that way. Even before sin entered into the world, God said it wasn't good for man to be alone. So community. It's a response. It isn't a response to weakness. It's part of God's original plan that he wanted to bring us together. Ecclesia, called out but assembled.
That's right. Well, Pastor, I know we need to land a plane here.
I'm all over the place. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
You're good.
What's the challenge for the listeners right now before we start this series?
Yeah, I'd simply ask people to wrestle honestly with one question. Have you rejected Jesus, what Jesus actually created? Have you rejected what he actually created, meaning the church? Have you rejected the church, because those are not always Jesus or the church. They're not the same thing, but there is a connection. And maybe you've experienced hurt. Let me speak it this way. Maybe you've experienced religion without relationship. That's happened in America, but don't allow a counterfeit version of church to keep you from discovering the real thing. Let me say this again, PJ. I was talking Sunday about it, and I ran out of time, but you know me, I'm a mechanic. I still got dirty fingers and all those things and blisters on the hands from working, but it was a knockoff version of a filter that I put on my truck that would not work right. And all that was wrong with it was it looked exactly the same, but it was a counterfeit. And maybe you've been in something that was a counterfeit religion and not in a genuine relationship. It looked right from the outside, but it wasn't right on the inside. That's why I said we've got to get to transformation, not just organization, but transformation, so that we can see resurrection power in people's lives. So here's all I would say. Give Jesus a chance. Give church a chance again. If you've been hurt, if you've been disappointed, if you're disappointed in yourself, here's all I want to say. Wipe the slate clean. Let's start fresh. And let's not do church, because it's important to Jesus and you're important to Jesus.
That's good, Pastor. That is real good. I think that's where we're heading. So we're going to tackle this church hurt a little bit in this series, right?
Yeah.
Hypocrisy, commitment, community, mission, and what the church has was always meant to be. So,
Yeah, and we're going to do it honestly to get rid of the hypocrisy. So if we can do it honestly, that's going to be really important. Here's what we want to say. Because Jesus is alive, the church is alive. Be part of something alive.
Which means the church isn't dead.
Come on, bro. Amen.
So.
Yeah, that's good, right?
Yep.
Well, guys, thanks for joining us. We hope you go out and make it a great day. And, hey, make Jesus famous. God bless you guys. Hope to see you again soon. Have a great day, and see you Wednesday night.